The morning they handed Raymond Olt the keys to a property he'd never seen. He was standing outside a Salvation Army in Tucson with $43 in his wallet and a retired military dog named Bravo sitting at his heel. The lawyer, a thin man in a pale blue suit who kept checking his phone, didn't get out of his car. He lowered the window just enough to pass an envelope through, said something about the estate of Harold Olt, and drove away before Raymond could ask a single question. Bravo watched the car leave. Then he looked up at Raymond. "Don't ask me," Raymond said. He sat down on the curb and opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded document, a hand-drawn map on the back of a grocery receipt and a rusted key attached to a piece of twine. The document said that Harold Olt, his father's older brother, a man Raymond had met exactly twice in his life, had died 6 weeks ago and left his entire estate to Raymond James Olt, formerly Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. Raymond hadn't spoken to Harold in over 20 years. He hadn't spoken to most of his family in nearly that long. There had been a time, after his third deployment, when talking felt like something other people did. Something that required a kind of energy he no longer had access to. He folded the document, put it back in the envelope, and looked at the map. The property was 70 miles northeast of Tucson, out past the national forest, up a dirt road that didn't appear on any official map. According to the grocery receipt, the drive would take about an hour and 40 minutes. He didn't have a car. He also didn't have anywhere else to be. They got a ride from a man named Felix who was hauling irrigation pipe out toward Wilcox. Felix didn't ask questions. He let Bravo sit in the back with the pipe. Raymond sat in the passenger seat and watched the city disappear behind them, watched the scrub flatten out into long, empty stretches, watched the mountains in the distance hold their position the way mountains always do. Indifferent, ancient, unchanged. Felix dropped them at a dirt crossroads 20 miles short of where they needed to go. Raymond thanked him, and they walked the rest. It took 4 hours. Bravo kept pace without complaint, which was something Raymond had always loved about him. 14 years old, a retired military working dog who'd served 2 combat tours before Raymond adopted him through the program. Bravo's muzzle had gone silver 3 years ago, and he walked with a slight hitch in his left rear leg since a training injury in 2019. But he never slowed down when Raymond needed to move. He simply adjusted and kept going. That was something they had in common. The property appeared around a bend in the dirt road, and Raymond stopped walking. He'd expected something bad. He hadn't expected this. The house was 2 stories, built in the Spanish colonial style, with a curved staircase that split and wrapped around both sides of the front entry. It might have been beautiful once, the kind of house you'd see in a magazine spread about the American Southwest, all pale stone and arched windows and iron balconies, but the windows were mostly broken now. Vines had come up over the lower walls and reached toward the second floor. Cracks ran through the stone facade like river systems on a map, and one section of the upper balcony railing had collapsed entirely and lay rusting in the dry grass below. The whole town of Soledad Creek, the nearest settlement, population maybe 400, had apparently been talking about this place for years. Raymond learned this later. He learned that people called it the Olt Wreck. He learned that Harold had been considered a hermit at best, a lunatic at worst, a man who'd bought 40 acres of desert 30 years ago, and slowly stopped coming into town entirely. He learned that when word got out that Harold had left the property to a nephew nobody knew. Some drifter, people said, some broken-down veteran with a dog. A few of the locals had laughed openly. Laughed in the feed store and the diner and the gas station that doubled as a post office. What could a man like that do with a place like this? Raymond didn't know the answer to that yet. He stood at the end of the drive and looked at the house and felt nothing in particular. No hope, no dread. Just a quiet curiosity that he hadn't felt in a long time, like a pilot light that had been off so long he'd forgotten it was there. Bravo made a sound beside him. Not a bark. Something lower, more considered. He took 3 steps forward and stopped, his nose working the air. "Yeah," Raymond said. "I see it too." He walked up to the front door and used the rusted key. The inside was worse than the outside, and also somehow better. Worse because of the dust. Years of it, thick enough to muffle sound. Worse because of the holes in the plaster, and the broken tiles, and the section of the kitchen ceiling that had come down entirely, probably in a monsoon season, leaving a ragged wound through which you could see the sky. Worse because the smell was specific and unsettling. The smell of a place that had been sealed up for a long time, holding its own air. Better because the bones were there. Raymond had done enough construction work between deployments, picking up labor jobs when he needed cash and couldn't sleep, to see that the structure was sound. The walls were thick. The foundation, from what he could tell standing in the main room, was solid. Someone had built this place to last. Harold had built it to last. The shelves along the north wall of the main room were still full of books, coated in dust but intact. A cast iron stove sat in the corner with a stack of wood beside it, dried out but still usable. In the kitchen, a hand-pumped well tap, an older installation, pre-electric, still produced water when Raymond worked the handle for a few minutes. Rust-colored at first, then clearing. He stood at the kitchen window and pumped water into an old tin cup he found on the counter and drank it. It tasted like iron and minerals and cold stone, and it was the best water he'd had in a long time. Bravo had been moving through the house slowly, systematically, the way he always moved through a new space. Room by room, nose low, tail quiet. Raymond had worked with enough military dogs to know that Bravo wasn't just sniffing out of habit. He was building a map, cataloging. The behavior went so deep it was almost involuntary, like breathing. Raymond found a broom and swept the main room. He found blankets in a cedar chest upstairs, moth-eaten but dry, and spread them on the least damaged floor. He found candles in a kitchen drawer, stubby and misshapen, but they burned. He didn't sleep well, but he slept. In the morning, Bravo was gone from beside him. Raymond was on his feet before he was fully conscious, the old training kicking in, and he was through the hallway and down the stairs in seconds. He found Bravo at the back of the house, in what had been a study or an office. A room Raymond hadn't looked at carefully yet. Bravo was standing at the far corner, staring at the floor, not digging, not scratching. Just standing and staring, his body tight with the kind of focused stillness that Raymond had learned, over years and across countries, to take seriously. "What is it?" Bravo didn't look up. Raymond crouched beside him and looked at the floor. Concrete, like the rest of the room. But here, in this corner, the concrete was a slightly different color. Darker, newer, the aggregate pattern just different enough that if you weren't looking for it, you'd never see it. A patch. Someone had patched the floor. Raymond ran his fingers along the edge. Roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. He pressed on it and felt nothing give. He looked around the room and found behind a collapsed bookcase an old pry bar coated in rust. It took him the better part of an hour to break the patch away. The concrete was about 4 inches thick and had been mixed tight. When it came up, there was a steel box underneath, set into a cavity in the earth, sealed with a padlock that was not rusted at all. The same key that had opened the front door opened the lock. Inside the box were 3 things. A sealed envelope with Raymond's name written on it in Harold's handwriting. Harold's handwriting, which Raymond hadn't seen since a Christmas card that arrived when he was 17 years old, and which he recognized immediately without knowing why. A small, leather-bound journal, and a cloth bag that clanked when Raymond lifted it. He opened the cloth bag first. Gold coins. American eagles, mostly, some older pieces Raymond didn't recognize. He counted them twice. He didn't know their current value with precision. But he knew enough to understand that what was in the bag was significant. He put the bag down carefully. He opened the envelope. Harold Olt had been, according to the letter, A man who'd made one serious mistake in his life and spent 30 years trying to correct it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, and Raymond read it 3 times. In the 1980s, Harold had been part of a land acquisition scheme in the Sonoran Desert. Not the main architect. Harold had been young, and he'd been brought in by 2 other men whose names Raymond didn't recognize. The scheme involved pressuring elderly landowners in rural communities to sell at a fraction of what their land was worth. In at least 2 cases, Harold wrote, the pressure had been more than financial. In at least 2 cases, people had lost land that had been in their families for generations, land with water rights that turned out to be worth far more than anyone understood at the time. Harold had taken his cut. He'd bought his 40 acres with part of it. And then, over the years, the weight of it had settled on him in a way that he hadn't anticipated, in the way that certain things settle. Not all at once, but gradually, the way water finds every crack and works it wider. He'd spent years trying to find the families. In some cases he had, and had found ways to send money anonymously. In other cases, the trails had gone cold. He'd documented everything in the journal. Names, dates, locations, the amounts he believed were owed. He'd also documented, as carefully as he could, the names of the 2 men who had orchestrated the scheme, men who were, by now, prominent in ways that would make certain people very uncomfortable. He left all of it to Raymond, because Raymond was the only member of the family Harold trusted, because Raymond had served with integrity in places Harold had only read about, because Harold had followed Raymond's career from a distance, the way certain lonely people follow the lives of others. Carefully, quietly, with a kind of hope they can't quite explain. I don't know if you'll think this is a gift or a burden, Harold had written near the end of the letter. I think it might be both. I'm sorry I didn't know you better. I think I would have liked to. Raymond sat on the concrete floor of the study with the letter in his lap for a long time. Bravo lay down beside him and put his head on Raymond's knee. The town of Soledad Creek was the kind of place where everybody knew what car you drove, what you ordered at the diner, and approximately how much money you had. It was not the kind of place that was easy to move through anonymously. Raymond walked in 3 days after finding the box. He'd cleaned himself up as well as he could. Shaved with a disposable razor he'd found in the upstairs bathroom. Changed into the better of his 2 shirts. Bravo walked at his left heel with the quiet authority he carried everywhere. And people noticed the dog before they noticed Raymond. He went to the diner first, because he needed coffee, and because diners were where information moved. He sat at the counter, and a woman named Sherry, her name was on her apron, which was on over a flannel shirt, which meant she'd been here since the cold morning, poured coffee without asking and said, "You the one out at the Olt place?" "Word travels," Raymond said. "It's Soledad Creek," she said. "Word's been there and back twice already." He drank his coffee. Behind him, he could feel the room. 2 men at a corner table, an older couple by the window, a teenager on a stool at the far end, calibrating him, trying to figure out what he was. "Harold ever come in here?" Raymond asked. Sherry refilled his cup before answering. "Used to, before. Years ago he used to come in every Thursday. Eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee." Then he stopped. "When?" She thought about it. Maybe 15 years ago, maybe more. He'd come in for supplies at the hardware store sometimes, but he stopped sitting down anywhere. She looked at him directly. "You actually family?" "His nephew." "He never mentioned a nephew." "He wouldn't have," Raymond said. "We didn't know each other well." That was the careful version. The honest version was more complicated. The honest version involved a family that had fractured years before Raymond was born. Fault lines he'd never fully understood. Silences that had been maintained so long they'd calcified into something that just looked like normal. He finished his coffee and left a 10 on the counter, which was more than the coffee cost, and which Sherry noticed. Outside, he stood in the thin morning sun, and Bravo sat beside him. and together they looked at the main street of Soledad Creek, the hardware store, the real estate office, the small church at the far end, and Raymond thought about what Harold had written. There are two families who are still owed, Harold had written. The Delacroix family and the Vasquez family. I believe the Vasquez family may still be in the area. I was never able to find them. I'm sorry for that. Raymond pulled out the journal and looked at the name again. Vasquez. He looked at the real estate office across the street. It was a place to start. What he found over the next 2 weeks was not a simple thing. The real estate office was run by a man named Garrett Finch, who was in his 60s and who, Raymond noticed, had a particular way of going very still when certain questions were asked. The kind of stillness that wasn't relaxation, but its opposite. Raymond didn't ask directly about Garrett. He asked about the history of land transactions in the area. He asked about old records. He was pleasant and patient, and he had learned over many years how to ask questions in a way that didn't look like asking. He went to the county recorder's office in Wilcox and spent 2 days with ledgers from the 1980s. He walked the property lines Harold had described in the journal. He found Elena Vasquez in a trailer on the edge of town. She was 74 years old, and she had grown up on 160 acres that her grandfather had homesteaded in 1931. The land had water rights attached. A spring-fed creek that still ran year-round even in drought years, and it was worth, now, significantly more than anyone had understood in 1986, when Elena's mother had been persuaded to sign the papers. Elena remembered the men who had come. She remembered their suits and their briefcases and their smiles. She didn't remember Harold specifically. He had been young, she said, and quiet, and had stood near the door the whole time. Raymond listened. When she was finished talking, he told her about the journal. He told her about Harold's letter. He didn't tell her about the gold coins yet because he needed to understand what he was doing before he did it. But he told her that there was documentation, that names were written down, that someone had kept a record of what had happened and who had made it happen. Elena looked at him for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because it's yours to know," Raymond said. Bravo had been sitting quietly beside Raymond's chair through the whole conversation, which was 20 minutes, then 40, then nearly 2 hours. At some point, Elena had given him a piece of beef jerky from a drawer, and after that, Bravo regarded her with the particular warmth he reserved for people he'd decided were trustworthy. Raymond trusted Bravo's judgment on that point more than he trusted most things. The situation with Garrett Finch and the other man, a developer named Stuart Crane, who lived in Scottsdale, and whose name appeared repeatedly in Harold's journal, became complicated quickly. Raymond hadn't planned to move fast. He'd planned to be careful, methodical, to understand the full shape of things before he made any decisions. But Bravo changed the timeline. 3 weeks after Raymond moved into the house, sleeping on the blankets from the cedar chest, eating canned goods from a box he'd had delivered to the end of the road, heating water on the cast-iron stove, Bravo woke him at 2 in the morning, not with barking, with a low, sustained sound that Raymond hadn't heard from him in years, a sound he associated with specific memories he didn't revisit willingly. Raymond was up and at the window in seconds. A truck was parked at the edge of the property with its lights off. 2 men stood near it, looking at the house. They weren't moving toward it yet, but they weren't leaving either. Raymond had no weapon. He hadn't carried one since he'd left the service, and he'd made that decision deliberately. He picked up the pry bar from the corner of the study. It was where he kept it now, out of a habit he hadn't examined closely, and went down the stairs and opened the front door and stood in the doorway. Bravo stood at his left knee. The 2 men looked at him. They were younger than he'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe, the kind of build that came from a gym rather than from labor. One of them took a step forward. "Private property," Raymond said. His voice came out flat and unhurried, the way it always did when his body had shifted into the particular register that 14 years of service had installed in him. "You're standing on it." The man who'd stepped forward stopped. The other one said something Raymond couldn't quite hear. "I'd encourage you to get back in your truck," Raymond said, "and go tell whoever sent you that there's nothing here worth what you're considering." A pause. Bravo had not made a sound since they came outside. He was simply standing there, still, watching. This was, Raymond had come to understand, more unsettling than barking. The men got in the truck and left. Raymond stood in the doorway for a long time after the taillights disappeared. He looked at Bravo. "Good boy," he said. In the morning he drove. He'd borrowed a truck from Felix, who turned out to live 40 miles away, and who had, for reasons Raymond didn't fully understand, taken a quiet interest in his situation. To Wilcox and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer in Tucson he'd heard about through the VA, a woman who did work on property rights cases. The second was to a journalist at the Arizona Daily Star, whose name he'd found in Harold's journal, because Harold had written, in a margin, "She investigated land fraud in Pima County 2009. She would understand this." Both women called him back within the day. The journal took 6 weeks to fully unravel. The lawyer's name was Christine Abernethy, and she was the kind of person who asked questions in a particular sequence, each one building on the last, until you understood that she'd been several steps ahead of you the whole time. She drove out to the property and sat in the main room. Raymond had fixed the worst of the broken windows by then, and borrowed a table and 2 chairs from Elena. And she read through the journal page by page and asked Raymond to explain anything she didn't follow. Bravo slept in the corner through most of this. He'd decided Christine was acceptable within about 4 minutes, and after that he'd lost interest in monitoring her. The journalist, whose name was Rosario Mendenhall, came separately. She was in her 40s and had the particular composure of someone who had heard many difficult stories and learned not to let her face do anything that would make people stop talking. She took careful notes and asked careful questions, and at the end of her first visit she said, "How long have you been living here?" 7 weeks, Raymond said. "Where before this?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. Tucson. And before that, a few other places. Rosario nodded. She looked around the main room. The swept floor, the candles, the stack of books Raymond had started reading in the evenings because there was nothing else to do. "You fixed the windows," she said. "I did. You planning to stay?" Raymond hadn't answered that question to himself yet. He looked at Bravo, who was watching him from across the room with the serene attentiveness of a dog who has seen enough of life to know that some things don't need to be rushed. "Haven't decided," Raymond said, which was not entirely true, but it was what he said. Stuart Crane's name appeared in print for the first time on a Thursday morning, in a story that ran on the front page of the Arizona Daily Star's regional section. Rosario had been careful and meticulous, and the story contained documentation. Copies of pages from Harold's journal, county records, testimony from Elena Vasquez. That was difficult to dispute. Garrett Finch's name appeared in the same story, in a supporting role. Raymond was sitting on the front steps with Bravo when he read it. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of clarity the desert has in early winter, when the light comes in at a low angle and makes everything look precise and significant. He read the story twice. He read Elena's name and thought about the afternoon he'd sat in her trailer and listened to her talk about her grandfather, about the spring that ran through the property, about the sound it made in wet years. Christine Abernethy had filed civil claims on behalf of Elena Vasquez and 2 other families she'd identified in the course of her own research. The gold coins, Raymond had decided several weeks ago, would go into a fund to cover legal costs and to supplement whatever settlements came through. Not his to keep, not Harold's to give, but a means of making something right that had been wrong for 30 years. He'd had one difficult conversation with Christine about this. She'd said, "Raymond, legally, Those coins are yours. He'd said, I know. She'd looked at him for a long moment. All right, she'd said. He hadn't told anyone in Soledad Creek about the coins directly. But somehow, because it was Soledad Creek, because word traveled there and back twice before you'd finished the thought, people had started to know or to suspect that something had shifted. Sherry at the diner had started leaving his coffee refills unasked. The man who ran the hardware store had given him a deal on replacement windows that Raymond was fairly certain wasn't the going rate. Elena had started stopping by on Wednesday afternoons with food, always described as leftovers, always more than leftover quantities. The town had laughed when they'd heard about him. He knew that. He didn't blame them. He would have had questions too, looking from the outside at a man with a dog and a duffel bag who'd walked in from nowhere to claim a ruined house in the desert. But things change. That's the thing about things. They change. The property took Raymond the better part of a year to make livable. He did most of the work himself, with some help from Felix, who turned out to have worked construction for 20 years before moving out to the desert, and who had particular opinions about load-bearing walls that Raymond learned to respect. He fixed the roof first, then the windows, then the plumbing. He replastered the interior walls in the main room and the kitchen. He left the study mostly as it was, except for filling in the concrete patch and putting a new floor over it. Not to hide anything, just because it needed to be done, and because what had been under there was gone now, resolved, handled. He built a ramp on the back step for Bravo, whose hip had gotten stiffer over the winter. Bravo used it with great dignity and without acknowledgement, as though it had always been there. He planted things along the south wall. Not because he expected them to grow especially well, but because Harold had kept plants along that wall. You could see the old planters still there, the soil in them long dead, and it seemed like the kind of thing a person should keep going if they could. He found a photograph, late in the renovation, tucked behind a loose piece of baseboard in the upstairs hallway. Harold as a young man, maybe 30, thinner than Raymond had imagined him, standing in front of the house when it was still new. He had a kind of cautious happiness in his expression, the look of a person who isn't sure yet whether they're allowed to feel good about something. Raymond put the photograph on the mantel in the main room. He thought Harold would have been uncomfortable with it there, but also that uncomfortable was appropriate, that some things should remain slightly uncomfortable to serve as reminders. One evening in late October, almost 14 months after the lawyer had passed him an envelope through a car window outside a Salvation Army in Tucson, Raymond sat on the repaired front steps and watched the sun go down over the desert. The light went through its progressions, gold to amber, to pink to a bruised purple, and the mountains held their position in the distance, indifferent, unchanged. Bravo lay across his feet, which he'd started doing in the last few months, when the evenings got cold, his silver muzzle resting on Raymond's boot, his breathing slow and even. Raymond thought about the families. About Elena, who had a hearing scheduled for next spring. About Christine, who believed the case was strong. About Rosario, who was working on a follow-up story about the broader pattern of rural land fraud in the state. He thought about Harold, who had spent 30 years carrying something that was too heavy to put down and had finally found a way to hand it to someone who might do something with it. He thought about the night with the truck and the two men and the pry bar. About what he hadn't done, standing in that doorway. About the things you don't have to become to remain yourself. Bravo shifted against his feet and made a small sound, the same sound he'd made almost a year ago at the end of a drive in Tucson. Considered low, something between an exhale and a word. Yeah, Raymond said. I know. The desert went quiet around them. The stars came out, more of them than Raymond had ever seen in any city he'd lived in, more than he'd seen in most of the places he'd been deployed. Out here, away from the lights, the sky was something you couldn't prepare for, the sheer number of them, the depth of the dark between. He looked up at it for a long time. He was still looking when the last of the light left the mountains.